Good morning on Friday, the 13th of November. And I just want to share with you this morning something written by Mark Fairweather Tall from the South Wales Baptist Association. And it's quite long, so I'll start it partway through. Perhaps at the beginning of this week, as we come out of the firebreak lockdown and new government guidelines are released, there will be a number of debates in churches across the country discussing to open or not to open. That is the question. In England, the question is slightly different because churches are at the beginning of a month-long lockdown, during which they are now banned from opening for public services. Many have spoken out about this, including the Archbishop of Canterbury and other senior Anglicans, and the CEO of the Evangelical Alliance. So it's difficult. He goes on to say, what is right? Should churches have to close during a national lockdown? Or is there any case for them to be a special case, allowing public worship to continue? Of course, there are many different opinions held and multiple reasons for the conclusions people have reached. This isn't just a difference of opinion. Neither is it simply a case of divided opinion among differing denominations or their leaders. Within each church, ministers, elders, deacons, and church members, there are those who feel strongly that either the church should or should not be open when the rest of the country is shut down. And it's a complex issue. And he highlights then a few things as we ponder that question. Corporate worship is important to us. He says going to church on a Sunday is something I've done for the whole of my life. It's a priority and it's always been a joy to gather with others to worship God. He says he loves to sing and hear the Bible read and hear God's word preached. And of course, we're not allowed to sing at present. And he continues, the Bible tells me of the importance of meeting with others. Jesus said that where two or three are gathered in his name, he will be with them. The writer of Hebrews urges us not to give up meeting together. Gathering together to worship God is important. And he says, maybe you, like me, lament the situation where we cannot gather. However, perhaps we should ensure we don't lose sight of the way God has been present with us. Technology has offered us ways to worship together and to participate in ways we might not have been able to do before. People are still able to gather and worship together, albeit virtually. And the use of chat facilities means that in some computer programs, we can engage with others and share. As we worship together, physically apart but present, God is with us. And he then says, I have long found a common phrase shared in church services, which has jarred with my understanding of God. It goes something like this: we come into God's presence today. However, I believe that God is present with me when I am not in the church building. Corporate worship is about celebrating and taking time to appreciate God's presence that all of us can experience wherever we are. And then he continues to say fellowship is important to us. Churches have worked incredibly hard to open in a COVID-safe way. Risk assessments have been done, new layouts have been designed, contents of services have been altered, and the desire to meet together is strong. And the part of this is the importance of connection that comes from being in the same place. We shouldn't be surprised by this, because God has made us to live in community with him and with one another. In a society where isolation and loneliness are becoming increasingly endemic, people's mental health is becoming a concern. Churches offer a place to build strength through fellowship. And As I say, this is a long piece, and if any of you want it, I can send you the link for the whole thing. And he then says, perhaps living with the lament of loss over not physically meeting together will help us discover new ways of enabling people to draw on God's strength. Many in our communities are lamenting over loss. They're robbed of previous certainties. We can't control things that we previously had some control over. And that sense of loss, too, is an issue. Getting it right is important to us. He writes, I was speaking to a minister recently who was facing the dilemma of to open or not to open. And he asked me, do you think we should open? My honest, if unhelpful answer was simply, I don't know. There are so many variables for each individual church and fellowship, and whichever way we go, there will be negatives as well as positives. In our case, one of the negatives we've managed to do amazingly well, but one of the negatives is without doubt that the church is cold. The pews are hard, of course, but they always were. But the church is cold because it has to be ventilated. And we have to ask ourselves the question, do we heat a space and then open all the doors? And that really probably doesn't make any sense. And so it's difficult. However, of course, the upside of all of this has been that many people who've been unable to physically attend church services for perhaps years are now able to share in worship virtually. And so there's been a definite advantage to a sector of our fellowships where they are actually able to join us in a way that they haven't been able to do before. So whether or not we open, Mark goes on, perhaps an important question is about whether we can grow a sense of connection with those inside and outside of the church. And he talks then about how difficult it is because every church is different. And it's very easy for people to point the finger and say, well, they've opened or they haven't, or they're doing this or they're doing that. And of course, there's any number of ways that these things can happen. Whether we decide to open or not, how can we foster a sense of God's presence with us as we worship? Whether we decide to open or not, how can we build a sense of fellowship where we can connect with each other? Whether we decide to open or not, how can we engage in our wider call within our communities, reaching out to those who do not know Jesus? To open or not to open, that is the question, or maybe that isn't really the most important question after all. Perhaps the more important question is how we can fulfill our calling from God to be in community effectively, regardless of whether or not we open our building on a Sunday for public worship. And I thought you'd be interested to hear some of those thoughts. I found it interesting when I read it, and I think it gives us food for thought. And so I will see some of you in person for a shortened service on Sunday morning. Our Sunday morning worship in church will now be no more than half an hour because of the fact that the temperature's dropping and we don't want folk to be cold. And there will also be an online service of a more average kind of length on Sunday morning too. And so I will be with most of you, I think, then. And until then, God bless.